Okay, I was just giving our attendees a minute or so to join us. We do have more registered to attend, but I think we'll make a start. And I'll start by introducing myself. My name's Leona Vaughan. I'm the Vulnerable Populations Lead for the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative at the United Nations University Centre for Policy Research. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is on the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And we'll be explaining the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, its background, what it has achieved so far, what it entails in terms of the referral processes, and how you as survivor support organisations can sign up to be involved. So I'm joined today by my colleagues, Sarah Crow from Polaris, Sarah Byrne from Moore and Van Allen, and Barry Koch, who all work with us on the Survivor Inclusion Initiative here at FAST. So I'm going to start by just a short presentation about the Finance Against Survivor and Inclusion Initiative, if I can possibly be allowed to share my screen, Jacob. So the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking initiative has been in place since 2018. It was a consequence of the investigation by the Financial Services Commission. Great, okay, thank you. I now have permission to share the presentation. Okay, can we see that? Lovely. Okay, so like I was saying, the initiative started in 2018. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership in response to calls from the G7, the G20 and the United Nations General Assembly to mobilise the private sector in the fight against modern slavery and human trafficking. And this has been achieved namely through the production of the FAST Blueprint, and you can see that here. The FAST Blueprint is a report and a toolkit to guide action in the financial sector to this issue. And to date, FAST has had substantial impact. We have trained thousands of financial sector professionals in more than 130 countries. We've mobilised institutional investors to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking. We've developed risk analysis tools for the sector and provided input into a range of multilateral and regulatory processes. We've also organised a coalition of banks and survivor support organisations to provide survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking with improved access to financial services. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So why does FAST exist? Well, the financial sector has three distinct connections to slavery and trafficking. Firstly, it has the potential to handle the proceeds of this crime. Secondly, it lends to and invests in businesses who may well be relying on slavery for cost reduction and profit. And thirdly, it's an acknowledgement that financial exclusion often contributes to and amplifies vulnerability to modern slavery. So within the blueprint, there are 5 goals that were set for the finance sector. Firstly, the goal to comply with the law against modern slavery and human trafficking. Secondly, the goal to know and show modern slavery and human trafficking risks in their supply chains and in their work. Thirdly, to use leverage creatively to mitigate and address modern slavery and human trafficking risks in the world. And fourthly, to provide and enable effective remedy for modern slavery and human trafficking harms. And this work with the Survivor Inclusion Initiative fits under that particular goal. The fifth goal is to invest in innovation for prevention. So let's come back to goal 4. Goal 4 is what this webinar is going to explain. The goal 4 talks about participating in the FAST Financial Access Project's Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And this webinar will explain the SSII, as we call it, Survivor Inclusion Initiative, and it will encourage your participation as survivor support organisations. So we don't need to explain why there is a need for reintegrating survivors into economic life. But, you know, it's worth reminding of ourselves of the reasons why this was set up. So survivors have often endured exploitation. Survivors have often discovered that their traffickers have hijacked their financial identity or banking products for money laundering or other criminal purposes, which may adversely impact their credit record and complicate financial recovery. And a lack of access to bank accounts for survivors has numerous knock-on effects in other parts of their recovery in their daily life. And that includes securing personal identification, acquiring legal employment, accessing and safely storing personal funds, as well as obtaining housing and beginning to make savings. This was partly a response as well to survivors who had attempted to open bank accounts, who had previously been denied services due to the risk indicators that have arisen from their financial histories, which they have no control over, but also simply sometimes because they lacked the required documentation. So helping survivors access basic banking tools and services is to allow them to rebuild their lives and to allow them to contribute to their communities and to reintegrate into their communities and wider society. So through this initiative, we bring together a dedicated coalition of financial institutions, survivor support organisations and survivors to facilitate survivor access to basic banking services such as checking and savings accounts, and to help survivors financial recovery and reintegration. So like I say, FAST came into being in 2018. This initiative was launched in 2019 in the UK, Canada and the US. And in that time, it's seen over 1,500 accounts opened in these countries. So that's 1,500 survivors who have been actively reintegrated into financial life. So we are looking to expand this work in FAST in ways that meets the needs of survivors in the countries of the Global South from 2022 onwards. But this particular webinar is focusing on those 3 areas that we're already involved in. So just to give you an idea of who is already involved in terms of the participating banks, we've got Ally Bank, Bank of America, Bank of the West, Barclays, BMO Financial Group, Citibank, HSBC, LCNB National Bank, Royal Bank of Canada, Scotiabank, Truist, US Bank and Wells Fargo to date. And this is what happens. So financial institutions and survivor support organisations sign up for involvement with FAST through a basis of participation agreement. And I'll let you know at the end of the webinar how to obtain this. So this agreement, it's not a legally binding document. It's rather a terms of how organisations and institutions are involved and work together to support survivors to open these basic banking services. So FAST is the connecting point in all of this. We connect the participating organisations to closely collaborate in streamlining survivor referrals and what we call onboarding. So actually getting survivors to the point where they can open and manage their account. And this is via the templates that we've provided, which participating organisations adapt to their own circumstances. So this close collaboration enables safe and reliable engagement with survivors. with often survivor support organisations helping to verify survivors' details and statuses with the bank. So taking the pressure and the onus and the sense of re-traumatisation away from survivors in supporting them to do that. So the FAST Secretariat, we provide training resources, we provide direct support, and periodically we convene all of the participating entities to facilitate some peer learning about what's working well, but also what some of the blockages are and how we can overcome them. And we've got 3 of those partners with us today. Like I say, Sarah, and Barry have been working with us really closely over the period of time that this initiative has been up and running. So I'm going to start by handing over to Professor Barry Koch, who will cover how SII works with the banks. So let me stop sharing my screen and hand over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Leona, and good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here, so thanks for joining us. So very briefly, my work in the anti-trafficking space has mostly been from the perspective of the financial sector. I ran large anti-money laundering and compliance programs for global organizations like American Express and Western Union. And when we set out to work in anti-trafficking, we understood that there were many stakeholders, but we were not social workers. We couldn't provide victim services. We were not legislators. We couldn't pass laws. We were not law enforcement. We couldn't arrest the bad guys. But we worked at a bank, and that's where all the money was. And this is a crime that is entirely about money. And we thought that if we could identify the trafficking, the businesses and how they were moving their money, we could help law enforcement take that money away, and we could disrupt the trafficking rings and hurt the traffickers' business. So we built models to identify suspicious transactions that we could then share with law enforcement, transactions that were indicative of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And some of those models actually led to victim rescues and asset forfeitures of trafficking businesses and successful prosecutions of traffickers. That work that I did at the bank led me to the Financial Sector Commission, which is the organization that was founded that predated the FAST initiative. I was one of the 25 global commissioners. That commission was sponsored by the governments of Australia, the Netherlands, and Liechtenstein, and it was co-convened by Professor Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate, who is the father of microcredit. You've all heard of him. When I was on the commission, in partnership with Sarah Crow of Polaris, we created the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And as you heard Leona say, we understood right from the start that many survivors come to learn, if they're lucky enough to escape, that their credit histories have been destroyed by their traffickers, their identities have been hijacked, and that can make it very difficult to get a job, to get an apartment, certainly to open a bank account. And that, of course, increases their vulnerability to being re-victimized. So we put together a consortium of banks and a group of victim service providers with the idea that it would help reintegrate survivors into mainstream financial services. I should mention, by the way, that the commission had commissioners from the government, from regulators, from government pension funds, from law enforcement, and survivors. One was a child soldier, one was sex trafficked from Eastern Europe, and we have always tried to take a victim-centric approach to many of the projects, and I'll mention some of that in a moment. But we created the SII. It was announced at the General Assembly in September of 2019. We're actually really thrilled at having proved the concept and some of the successes. I've heard that the numbers are actually approaching 2,000 now, which is wonderful news. Some of the banks actually view the this target market as one that they want to expand into life insurance and home loans and education loans and providing training on financial literacy. So we are optimistic and enthusiastic about the future of the SII. Just very briefly, before I hand it back to Sarah, I should mention, that if you bring your clients to a bank, and if a bank account is established, that relationship is subject to all of the customer privacy and confidentiality rules that the bank is otherwise subject to. The UN University is not in the middle of that relationship in terms of identity of your customer, of your client. All of the privacy and confidentiality rules are observed by the bank. Your clients they actually have some choices about which banks and what types of banks they may prefer. The UNU has no preference there and no financial interest in what decisions are made, but we have participating banks with a geographic distribution to correspond to some of the victim service providers who are members. So we have banks in the Northeast, we have banks in the South, in the Midwest, on the West Coast. They all have branch networks, but we also have an internet bank. There are some survivors who really don't like the idea of having to go to a branch and be interviewed face-to-face by some bank personnel and talking about perhaps trigger events. They would rather open the account online, and that is something that is available. Ally Bank is entirely online. They have no bricks and mortar. And that is another example of how we try to take a victim-centric approach to providing this. Very quickly, we have had some really nice successes in addressing some of the legal and compliance issues that the banks and that your clients have encountered. Typically, that involves a survivor's loss of identification documents. The trafficker still has my passport, or the trafficker has my driver's license. Well, we've been able to work with the banks, and within the law and within the rules, we have been able to come up with appropriate and reasonable substitute documents so that the banks can satisfy their compliance requirements about customer verification. I think I will stop there, other than to say that we're glad you're here, and we hope that we'll hear from you to the extent that there are issues with your clients encountering various questions with the banks. We've had issues about clients who may have arrest records, and we've had some successes in working those out as well. We've had very good support from regulators in Canada and the US, and with law enforcement as well. But to the extent that there are issues, we encourage you to make the UN University the central point of contact. And we've had a good record of facilitating the applicants. And I will stop there and hand it back to you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. So as Barry mentioned, I think we're all quite familiar with the complexities and special circumstances that a lot of trafficking survivors are facing when trying to open these accounts. And what I've also learned from Barry is that, while banks have to comply with these regulations that in some cases can be quite complicated, the regulations also do allow for a certain amount of accommodations to be made in special circumstances. And so what we've really done here is worked with banks to establish kind of alternative account opening processes where, rather than just going into a branch and speaking to any employee at a bank, you're going directly to people who are anticipating that your clients may have some of these special circumstances. They've thought through some of the accommodations. They are when something new comes up, they're in a position to reach out and make sure they can get authority to make additional accommodations and really work through some of those issues with all of you. So participating is quite simple. As Leona mentioned, you'll receive terms of participation. If you accept them, then FAST will share with you a couple of different resources, one of which is kind of the most important resources, and that is really the directory of financial institutions and how to contact those financial institutions. So different financial institutions may have a different process, but that resource shows how to reach out, who to contact, and go from there. So as you're working with clients and you recognize a client who has a goal of opening a bank account, what you would want to do is talk to them about this project, talk about the participating financial institutions, and get a sense from them if they have a bank that is kind of their choice bank. And that could be based on geography or the online banking options that Ally offers, as Barry mentioned. Then you'll get permission from your client to contact that bank, and then you'll make that initial referral. So, sometimes that might be emailing to make a referral, and then the bank will respond and set up a time to talk more or set up a time to meet with your client. Each bank kind of gives directions and instructions on how to do that. And then, we encourage case managers and those working with clients to continue to support your client through the account opening process. Some of these account openings may be relatively simple and quick, but I think what we know from the regulations is they are complicated. And so a lot of the facts and situations need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So there may be, in certain special circumstances, a little bit more back and forth that needs to happen. For instance, the bank may typically require one sort of identity document. They may be amenable to accepting an alternative identity document that your client has access to, but there may need to be some back and forth conversation about, okay, what does your client have? Will that be acceptable? That sort of thing. And then if there are issues there, the FAST initiative is available to provide support. Both Barry and Sarah have provided a lot of guidance and resources as well in navigating this process. And that is really it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who has unique experience both in referring clients through this process and also works closely with financial institutions, so has that kind of legal compliance angle as well.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As mentioned, I'm Sarah Byrne, and I join you today as a referring survivor support organization. And as Sarah had mentioned, I lead the Warren Van Allen Human Trafficking Pro Bono Project, which is the program through which we provide free legal representation to survivors. But I also advise banks on their development of anti-trafficking programs and programs to support survivors. So I'm sort of uniquely situated to work with all stakeholders in this important initiative. My firm became a referring service provider back in early 2020, and we've referred a number of survivors, despite a pandemic, to a number of banks. And proudly, I'll mention that my very first Survivor Inclusion Initiative referral was that bank's very first Survivor Inclusion Initiative account. So it's been really rewarding to watch the initiative evolve sort of on the ground from both the bank perspective and the survivor perspective. So I've seen firsthand the impact that access to financial services can have on survivors following their exploitation. But I've also seen banks working really hard to get better in order to best support survivors and understand the survivor experience and what they could do to best accommodate their needs. So I'll just give a couple of tips from the perspective of a referring service provider. As you have heard today, onboarding as a survivor support organization is really easy. It's non-committal. There's nothing onerous about the process. The organization believes that just as there should be no barriers to financial services to survivors, there ought to be no barriers for service providers like ourselves to support our clients in enabling them to have access to bank services. And one of the greatest features that we've observed about this initiative is the breadth of choice for survivors. And that ranges, Barry had mentioned this, that ranges from the choice of which bank to access banking services and products, to the branch that would be most convenient to the survivor, to the type of account that would meet their priorities, lifestyle, and needs, even down to the features of the account. So to service providers, I encourage you to the extent that you refer survivor clients, to work with them to both advocate to the bank personnel during onboarding, but also account maintenance to ensure that their needs are being met, and so that the survivors understand the choice that they have in this process. And as Sarah had mentioned, I hope you know that you're very much supported by the UNU in navigating any challenges that we might meet with banks. As Barry had mentioned, the banks have been very accommodating to responding to any challenges that our survivor clients might meet. So I encourage you to leverage that. And I also wanted to offer my contact information to you all. Feel free to reach out. As Sarah had mentioned, because I work with both the banks and I provide feedback to FAST about the survivors on the ground experiences and the experiences of service providers, please know that I'm a voice for you all as we all work to improve this process and increase engagement, and most of all, enhance the experience for survivors. So I hope that you'll join us. If you're not already signed on, I'm going to punt it back to Dr. Vaughn to tell you exactly the very simple process of joining, but I hope that you'll join us. And again, I'm available for any questions after today.
Many thanks, Sarah. And yes, thank you, Sarah and Barry. I think that you have given all of our participants a full understanding of the different dimensions of the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. Like I've said in the chat, if you do have any questions, do pop them into the Q&A. But I'm just going to quickly go through what the next steps should be. Okay, so hopefully you can see that there. So I would say the first step really is to email for onboarding and for the basis of participation documents. So email us directly at fast@unu.edu. We will then send you the information. If you can then reply by sending the signed document back to FAST, we can then send you the details for referrals and participating banks. As Sarah mentioned, this is a fully inclusive set of information which will tell you, the options that the survivor clients that you're working with can have. If you'd like further information on the Survivor Inclusion Initiative and what we've done so far, there is the FAST Initiative website, and that's fastinitiative.org. And if you go to the resources/SII resources, you'll see a range of resources, webinars, documents that will help you to support your clients. You can also sign up to our newsletter on that website, and you can follow us on Twitter. I think the last thing I wanted to mention, and really just to flag to you all, is the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, UNODC. They run the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims, which provides funding to survivor support organisations. Now, that's not directly connected to the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, but we do acknowledge that most survivor support organisations are usually in need of additional support for their infrastructure. So the website is there for that trust fund, and I know that they open for applications a number of times during the year. So again, I'd ask if anyone has any questions directly you'd like to put to the panelists, please do pop them into the Q&A chat. If not, please feel free to email us directly at FAST. I know Sarah Byrne has also offered to be a connecting point. If you email us, we can send your email on to Sarah. But unless there are any questions that you have right now that you'd like to put to our panelists, I would say a final thank you for attending. Thank you to our panelists for giving such a great insight to our attendees. And I hope to hear from you all soon. So please do follow up with an email and take a look at our website resources. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.